I believe two of the most important cameras have been released during our lifetime on this earth. Two cameras that will go down as classics and talked about for decades to come. Both hybrid and very capable cameras. Under $2,500, 422 10-bit, magnesium alloy, and yet, so different. The a6700 and the a7IV are very different hybrid cameras, but have benefits that may appeal to you on what you're shooting. In this video, I plan to show you the strengths and weaknesses, similarities and differences, and most importantly, the image quality out of both of these cameras. The a6700 is an APS-C camera with a lighter APS-C lens lineup. It would make it better for travel and vlogging, whereas the a7IV is full frame, which weighs more, especially if you add full frame lenses to it. But it will have better low light performance, have a shallower depth of field, and has two card slots, which makes the a7IV a more professional camera. But it can only shoot in 4K 60 with a crop, whereas the a6700 can shoot in 4K 120 with a crop. So if you wanted to shoot in 4K 120, then you might want to go with the a6700 because of the higher resolution. It's things like this that we're going to be covering today in this video, and I want to give you real-world application use rather than just listing off all the specs. After you're done watching this video, if you're still on the fence about which one of these two cameras you like, I would recommend renting both of them from Lens Rental so you can get your hands on them, try them out, and see if they suit your needs. So I have all that information in place, the stage is set, and we're ready to go. I always like to see the colors out of different lenses when I'm using each camera body, and it's for that reason that I use these lenses for both the photography and video tests out of both of these cameras. I use the full frame Tamron 28 to 75mm f2.8, a Tamron 17 to 28 f2.8. We threw a full manual APS-C city lens on both cameras, which was a 7 Artisans 25mm t1.05 for some of those more cinematic shots, and of course the Sony kit lens, the 16 to 50mm f3.5 to 5.6. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Are you ready? Let's go. The a6700 is cheaper than the a7IV by quite a bit, and when I say cheaper, I don't mean in the construction sense, but in the pricing. Both cameras are well built. In fact, they do have a lot in common. Let's jump into the similarities so we have a good foundation to stand on before we get into the differences. Both cameras are hybrid cameras with electronic viewfinders. They're both constructed with magnesium alloy. They both have fully articulating 3-inch touchscreens. They take the same battery, can shoot in 422 10-bit, both have focus breathing compensation, focus mapping, a mic port, headphone port, HDMI, and USB-C ports. The same menu system, all the picture profiles including S-Cinetone, and both have intelligent hot shoes. We can see how these cameras have many similarities, and that's the easy part. Now let's jump into the differences, which is where the real value lies in figuring out which one of these two cameras is better for you. I'll start with the bodies, and then we'll dive into the settings and the menu, and along this entire journey I'll be showing you comparison videos that I got with both of these cameras in both photo and video. When we add memory and the battery to the a6700, it weighs 493 grams, and the a7IV weighs 658 grams, which is a big difference, especially if you're looking for a camera and lens setup that would be good for vlogging or travel. Size and weight of the camera body and lenses truly does matter to a lot of people depending on the application you are using them for. And if you go with a bigger full frame body and lens selection, then you'll have a consistent issue of a heavier setup, and that may be something that you don't want. Both cameras are rugged and they're built with magnesium alloy, which means they will both last longer over a period of time instead of breaking down over a few years with some of the plastic bodies that we've been seeing. The hand grip on the a6700 is wider and more robust than the hand grip on the a7IV, but both hand grips extended about the same amount of distance. I didn't notice that much of a difference like I would have if I was comparing a camera like the ZV-E10 or the ZV-1, which virtually has no grippable hand grip. I much prefer these bigger grips because it will prevent that accidental drop, especially when you've been shooting outside for a while and your hands get a little sweaty. I've noticed that once you get those sweaty hands and the grips on the camera start to get a little bit wet, it's almost impossible to stop that slippage effect. But with these bigger grips, I never had any issues. Regardless of whatever camera you choose, try to budget for a camera cage that will give you mounting points to add accessories and protect your camera in case you drop it. I've never dropped my a7S III, but I have dropped my ZV-E10, and thankfully it had a cage on it. I've seen a lot of reviews online that says the a6700 is weather sealed, but I couldn't find anything official on Sony's website or B&H Photo. I did find, however, that the a7IV includes weather-resistant sealing, so snowy weather isn't a problem for camera reliability. In terms of portability and low-key setups, I would go with the a6700 because you can put it in your pocket, you have more room in your camera bag for other lenses, and have less weight to strain over for longer periods of time while you're consistently shooting. As I mentioned earlier, the a6700 and the a7IV have electronic viewfinders, but the a6700 has a 2.36 million dot viewfinder with 1.0 times magnification, where the a7IV has a 3.6 million dot viewfinder and only has 0.78 times magnification. magnification. Viewfinder magnification is how large the image appears inside of the viewfinder. It does not affect the framing, but the larger magnification is better to use because it makes it easier to see the details. Although the a7IV has 1.3 million more dots, it would really come down to what you are using it to shoot. Macro shots, portraits, landscapes. If you're a glasses wearer, these are all things that you need to consider when deciding on which camera has the better EVF that suits you. If you prefer to use the display rather than the EVF, then let's talk about the displays. Both cameras have a 1.03 million dot touch display. Both screens are 3 inches and are fully articulating, which makes it really nice for people who film themselves like I'm doing right now. You can also change exposure settings through the display of the a6700 to make it easier to nail exposure, whereas the a7IV you can only run through the menu system or custom buttons that you set up on the outside. I prefer to not touch my screen at all because I don't want to get it muddied up over time. Makes it harder to see, especially if you're in high key environments. I would not recommend using your shirt to clean off the displays because there's already detergents and oils in your clothing. Rather, use a cloth that's made for cleaning lenses or glass displays. Here at the Film Alliance, I think we can all agree that one of the hardest parts about creating a video is finding the right music that perfectly complements the story you are trying to tell. You want it to be perfect, and you want it to carry the viewer seamlessly through the end of the video. Track Club allows you to do this by being able to infinitely customize the stems of any song, muting or soloing instruments, adjusting volume levels, and speeding up or slowing the BPM to match the energy of the video. It gives you a greater level of creative control over your sound, all without leaving your browser. The first step in my creative process is deciding what filters match the vibe I'm going for or a particular part of a video. I've been able to take my videos to a whole new level since I started using Track Club. Try it out for yourself. I'll leave a link in the description for a free, full access 2-month trial. Both cameras have headphone ports, mic ports, USB-C, and HDMI for recording. The HDMI on the a6700 is a micro port and the a7IV is a full-size HDMI. This is a huge advantage to those of you who use HDMI ports to record externally. The micro HDMI of my a7III started to become loose over time, and I can't imagine how much it would be just to replace it. Also, the a7IV has a micro USB which is used for transferring files, and the USB-C on the a6700 is full-size. This makes the a6700 better for transferring files. The USB-C on the a7IV is only used for charging. The a6700 has one card slot, and I really appreciate the dual card slot on the a7IV because it means you can either have redundancy for backup recording, or you could have the camera set up to record all your media to one card, and as soon as it gets filled up, it can switch over to the other card, which means you get to shoot for double as long as whatever the size of the SD card is inside of your camera. Now, as far as redundancy goes, I've never had a file go corrupt on one of the SD cards that I was using with one of my Sony cameras, but that's because I use reliable cards like the SanDisk cards, and I never let my camera shut off in the middle of recording. I'm pretty aware of where my battery levels are while I'm filming. But with that said, 2 card slots are always better than one, especially for that peace of mind. With that said, the a7IV can also take the CF Express Type A cards, which I've never bought because they're too expensive for me, but they are super reliable. The a6700 has less buttons and dials, which means you cannot customize it as much as you can with the a7IV. This is a subjective category because some people like the minimum amount of buttons and dials like an Apple iPhone, where others prefer more. I prefer more buttons and dials for the type of content that I create. I don't have time to search through quick menus or function dashboards just to change something. I like to have the button or the dial on the outside of the camera I can physically adjust or push. Both cameras do have that front dial where you can use your forefinger to turn it easily. I set mine up for aperture, and it's been super helpful as long as I'm using a lens that has that functionality. Both cameras also have that mode dial where you can quickly switch between videos, photos, and S&Q without having to dive into your settings. I know these are similarities, but they are different from what we got with a lot of other Sony cameras in the past, so I thought it was worth mentioning. The a7IV has an autofocus joystick as well, where you can really hone in on what you want to focus on. A lot of photographers rely heavily on this autofocus joystick, so it's something that you need to consider. In an unbelievable tie, both cameras overheated at the 37-minute mark with active stabilization and autofocus on in 4K 60, and they both lasted longer than 1 hour when I shot in 4K 24. We already talked about frame rates and resolution for both of these cameras, but I wanted to mention that when shooting in 4K 120 on the a6700, you get a pretty heavy crop. When you consider that crop with the 1.5 times crop that you already get with the APS-C sensor, and if you're shooting 4K 120 in low light with your a6700, the image quality will really take a tumble. When shooting in 4K 60 with your a7IV, you get about a 1.5 times crop, which effectively frames it like an APS-C camera. If you bought the a7IV only to shoot 4K 60, then you'd probably just buy some APS-C lenses for it and use it as an APS-C camera. If you really want to shoot with a full frame camera at 4K 60, then you might need to go with something like the a7S III, FX3, or A1. I wouldn't buy the a7IV if 4K 60 is a deciding factor for you. I would go with the a6700 because when shooting in 4K 60, you would have no crop. The a7IV is a much better camera when used at 4K 24 or 4K 30 in low light, especially with its 33 megapixel sensor. You also have the option of shooting in Super 35 crop mode on the a7IV, which not only gives you a variety of framing choices, but also the option of using APS-C lenses designed for APS-C cameras without having any vignetting issues. In my video tests, I was seeing that I was getting a little bit softer of an image out of the a7IV in Super 35 crop mode over the a6700. This makes sense because if we were only using a portion of the a7IV sensor while we're shooting in Super 35 crop mode, our image wouldn't be as sharp as the a6700. The a6700 can also shoot in 1080 up to 240 frames per second. So if you want to get some of those really slow motion shots in 1080, then you need to go with the a6700. The a7IV can shoot in 1080 up to 120. The advertised dynamic range out of the a6700 is 14 stops, and I found information all over the place when it came to the a7IV. The a6700 samples 6K down to 4K, and the a7IV samples 7K down to 4K, which tells us that the dynamic range out of the a7IV will be better. Let's look at the side-by-side comparison, and you could be the judge of which camera you think has better dynamic range performance. I shot in both S-Log3 and Cine 2 with some low-key grading in post, really to try to minimize any of those highlight blowouts or squashing any of the shadows. Both cameras have 759 autofocus points, but a big advantage the a6700 has over the a7IV is the AI processing unit, which provides the a6700 with better autofocusing systems for a wider variety of subjects. You can focus on trains, planes, animals, and insects, and the a6700 is just simply faster at focusing and more reliable. If you're buying a camera for its autofocus capabilities, then go with the a6700. With the new AI processing unit with the a6700, we got all of those new cool features like auto framing. I don't know if this has anything to do with that new AI processing unit, but you can internally record time-lapse with the a6700, whereas the a7IV, you have to do it all through the interval shooting function within the menu system. I've used that for a long time, and it gets pretty hard to use over time, especially because you have to take those images into post and seam them together so that you can have a working time-lapse. With the a6700, you can export full 422 10-bit video files in S-Log3 if you want to grade it yourself in post. The a6700 definitely has better functionality with all of these little perks that you get. The a6700's burst rate is 11 frames per second with a faster buffer, and the a7IV has 10 frames per second. Both cameras can shoot in JPEG and RAW, and the a6700 can shoot in lossless compressed RAW, and they can both shoot in the HEIF format. If you're curious as to what this is, when the camera records images in the HEIF format, they have the same image quality as JPEG images, but require a smaller file size since HEIF compression is more efficient, which means you can get about twice higher than that of a JPEG. As a result, the camera can save and transmit data very efficiently. With APS-C cameras, you get that extra 1.5 times reach, which is great for sports and wildlife photography, birds and insects, and the lens options will not be as expensive, but that 1.5 times crop, you also lose that 1.5 times aperture range. So if I'm using an f2 lens on my APS-C camera, it really does become f3.5, which means you won't get that much of a blurry background as if you were using a full frame camera. But because the a6700 is APS-C and the a7IV is full frame, you will have a shallower depth of field than what you would have gotten with the a6700. So the image information that is captured by the sensor can be much shorter. When shooting photography, I prefer mechanical shutter because it doesn't capture those weird light frequencies as much as an electronic shutter does. Also, mechanical shutter prevents rolling shutter like we get with electronic shutter. Rolling shutter doesn't only affect video, but also pictures as well, which is truly something that you have to consider if you're picking up either one of these hybrid cameras. Both cameras have sensor shift, 5-axis stabilization, and active steady shot, but the a6700's AI processing unit also improves communication between the body and the lenses, providing more stable framing to minimize shake. But don't forget that the a6700 also has a 1.5 times crop already, and the wider lens you use, the smoother footage you will get. But neither camera has dynamic stabilization like we saw with the ZVE one, which is truly incredible, and I wish we had it, but we don't. Both cameras record gyro data inside of the camera, which you can put through Sony's Catalyst Browse software and smooth out your footage even more to be like gimbal-like footage. But I don't use Catalyst Browse because it's an extra step in my workflow, and for some reason it takes forever for me to export. I would recommend picking up a gimbal instead and just getting it right in camera. One reason I would get Catalyst Browse is to remove that rolling shutter the electronic shutter produces when filming video. In my test, the a6700 performed a lot better than the a7IV. Unless we put the a7IV into Super 35 crop mode, then it became about the same. But I'm sure someone's not interested in buying the a7IV just to put it in Super 35 crop mode so they can reduce that rolling shutter. If you're a vlogger, you can get an ultra wide lens with your a6700, but the full frame a7IV will always give you a wider frame than the APS-C because of that 1.5 times crop. But don't forget, if you go with the a7IV, you'll have to get heavier lenses, and that might strain your shoulder, especially if that's the type of vlogging you're going to do. Both cameras have all of the picture profiles plus S-Cinetone, but the a6700 you have the ability to upload custom LUTs. I use this function with the FX30 and it made it super easy to expose everything right in camera rather than having to guess, especially when I'm shooting in a log profile. If you're shooting in a log profile with the a7IV, you can turn on Gamma Display Assist, which applies color correction to the log image displayed on the screen. The a6700 has a newly designed built-in microphone with 2 holes on the front, which theoretically would make it have better sounding native audio than the a7IV, which does not have any holes in the front of it. But don't let me sway you by the specs. Let's listen for ourselves and see what you think, and you can be the judge on which one has a better native audio sound. Native audio test with the a6700. We're outside, there's a blower in the background. We're in the woods, so there's some insects. There's not a lot of wind out here, but it is outdoors. So this is what it would sound like if you shot with the a6700 with no external mic outside, and I'm using the Tamron 17 to 28mm lens for your reference. So here we are again outdoors with the a7IV. I got that blower in the background still. I'm using the Tamron 17 to 28mm lens. I have the picture profiles off for both cameras. All right, so here we are back indoors to see what the a7IV sounds like straight out of camera without any external mics. We are in a controlled sound environment. This is my studio where I pretty much record all of my YouTube videos. So we don't have any external noise other than maybe the air condition that turns on maybe every 20 minutes. Okay, so here we are now with the a6700 to see how that native audio sounds. Like I said with the a7IV, it's a controlled sound environment, and the only thing that I really have in here that's making any type of noise is the person who's typing in the background. So other than that, there's your audio test for the a6700 in a controlled sound environment. For better audio out of both of these cameras, I would say take advantage of the intelligent hot shoe, where you can actually hook up a Sony mic like the ECM-1, which connects to the camera straight through the hot shoe and records way cleaner audio without having any external wires connect to your camera. The a6700's ISO sensitivity is 100 to 32,000 for video, and the a7IV is 100 to 102,400. The a6700 sensor is a sensor out of the FX30, which means it has a dual base ISO of 800 and 2500. The a7IV's native ISO is 800 to 3200 when shooting in S-Log3. This is where the camera sensor performs the best with the least amount of signal to noise ratio. I try to shoot everything in the base ISO and just throw an ND filter on the end of it to stop it down. In these tests, I tested out a variety of ISO ranges to see when the camera images started to fall apart. Clearly, the full frame a7IV outperformed the APS-C a6700. Both cameras allow you to live stream straight out of the USB-C cable. However, I'd probably be more concerned about overheating. If you're getting either of these cameras purely for live streaming, I'd say go with the FX30 due to its built-in fan. Live streaming produces a lot of heat, and you need to be cautious of that before you jump into live streaming. You can't do any picture profiles like S-Log3, you just shoot straight out of camera. Although both cameras can charge from the USB-C port, it doesn't mean that they're going to stay fully charged and through the entire live stream either. They lose power through a slow trickle effect, but it still will last a pretty long time. To use live streaming, you have to activate the USB streaming inside of the user menu and connect your camera over a USB-C port straight to your computer without a capture card, which is pretty nice. If at all possible, I'd recommend you asking yourself, what are you using these cameras for? And if you still don't know and you want to get your hands on them, then rent them from somewhere like Lens Rentals. Try them both out and see which one better suits your needs. The a6700 has a clear image zoom and doesn't lose the ability to have eye autofocus, which is a huge benefit to those of you who would like to have that extra reach if shooting people or humans or going out and shooting wildlife photography. For what I do, I prefer full frame, mainly because I own full frame lenses and I use my cameras in low light situations a lot, and I would at least prefer to have something that works better in low light in case I find myself in that situation. But if I didn't own any full frame lenses and I was starting from scratch, then I would definitely pick up the a6700 because it's a super valuable camera, and not to mention the APS-C lenses that you can also get for it will keep you on less of a budget than if you went full frame. Please let me know in the comment section which one of these two cameras you like better and why. Also, what other cameras you would like me to verse the a6700 to. Alright, I'm Joe with the Film Lines. Thank you for watching, and until the next one, have a nice week.